Hi and welcome to my tutorial. My name's Matt Rowe. I'm an artist based in Folkestone's Creative Quarter. I work with sculpture, photography and computer game design. In today's workshop we're going to be looking at sandcasting. Sandcasting is a really cool technique that can be used to create fantastic sculptures. Now you might notice here in my porthole view I've got a fantastic range of bits and bobs that have been collected from the beach. So I've been out and I've collected all these things from the beach and I've brought them back home ready for my casting session. Now you might want to do your casting directly on the beach, but for today's session, for this tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how you can do it at home. So what I've got here is a mixture of things that I might embed into my sand casting mould, from buttons to bottle tops to old screws. I've also got some sticks and bits of wood that I might use to help shape my mould and create the form that I'm going to cast. Now by now all of you guys should have collected your Block 67 workshop pack and be wondering what you're going to do to make this plaster and this mould. So first of all, we're going to collect the objects and then I'm going to jump into the second part of the tutorial where I'll show you how to do all the practical mixing and casting. So get down the beach and get beach combing and I'll catch you guys in the next section of the tutorial. So one, you're going to need your tray of cool bits and bobs that you've collected. Number two, a measuring jug. Number three, you're going to need your 1 kilogram pack of casting plaster. This is plaster of Paris, it's a fine casting plaster and it should be pre-weighed out for you in your Block 67 pack. Number four, you're going to need a flexible mixing bowl. This is a filler bowl that I got from Screwfix cheap and it's nice and flexible to chip out the excess plaster once it's dried. And number five, you're going to need some sand. I've got mine in a large old jam pan. You might want to use the beach or just a regular bucket. Okay, so what you want to do is you want to get your sand bucket and you're going to mark out roughly the shape you want. I'm going to create some crazy abstract head and I think it's really important that we kind of get the size right straight away. So what I like to do is I like to mark out the exterior of my mould and then I'm going to dig down in here to create a negative space. Now a negative space is the inside out part of a mould. Okay, so the important part here when we're digging is that we dig inwards from our mould and we create a negative space. So one of the things we're going to do is just remove some of the sand, leaving this top half here very flat. It's only the interior that we want to remove. Now, I'm just using 2 bits of wood, so you don't really need too many specialist tools. Let's fling this to the side. And if you've ever made a sandcastle, you'll know exactly what to do. It's just like digging a moat. And the more time you take to get this right, the better your results are going to be. Now, I'm going to pause right here and hand over to my assistant, who's going to create a wonderful sculpture. But just for a measure, you probably want to go down about 2 to 3 inches maximum. But remember, if your sand container doesn't contain that much sand, you may need to go a little bit shallower. Okay, so you can see here my assistant digging out the sand and he's piling it up at the side in a very neat fashion. Keeping a nice tidy workspace is always a good idea. You can see here how he's putting in some crazy shell eyes. This is a fantastic use of the found materials from the beach. So these bits are going to be put in only just a little bit, they're not pushed in too far because we want the plaster to pick out those details. So we want to just kind of push them in about halfway. It's important that the plaster can envelop, that's go around these details in order for them to stick in the final piece. Fantastic use of bottle tops. Notice that the colourful side is facing upside down in the mould. That's because this mould is going to cast inside out. So the negative space will be filled with plaster and anything on the surface will be included in the mould. Now, if you want to get really technical, you can draw some lines into the sand using your tools. This chopstick would make an ideal device. And we're going to draw inside the actual thing, or maybe even poke some dots. That could be a really interesting way of getting texture into your mould. Now the plaster is quite fragile, so it might break off a little bit in the mould, but it's a great way of pushing down in, and fine casting plaster is like a liquid, so it will set hard but it will go into all the areas where there's negative space. So don't be afraid to experiment with different techniques. Notice here how my assistant is using the peg to create some different levels of detail around. This is going to create a kind of hair effect, and the plaster should infill that. Oh, horns, yes, sorry. It looks more like horns actually on closer inspection. Could be a unicorn, could be a crazy robot, could be a monster. We'll see at the final piece. This tool has a textured effect on it, so it should give a kind of waffle-like effect. Remember, thin lines like this may not come out in your sculpture because they are very, very thin. So you'll need to dig down a little bit deeper in order to make that work. Notice how my assistant is now digging around that line to make that happen. Okay, and we're going to add the final little bits and pieces, and that's our mould complete.
Just for one thing more.
Couple more. Remember, the more bits and bobs you collect, the more opportunities you've got for creating crazy, crazy sculptures. So when your mould's complete, we'll move on to our next stage, which we're going to be doing outside in the garden because it's extra messy. And that's where we're going to be learning to mix our plaster. Hi, and welcome back. In this section, we're going to be looking at how we mix our plaster. Now, plaster is a powder that needs water to activate a chemical reaction that turns it into a solid form. Now, what I've done here is I've worked out my measurements. So 1 kilo of plaster, which you should be supplied with from your Block 67 workshop, needs approximately 700 millilitres of water. This particular plaster I've got needs 750 millilitres of water, but I think yours is 700. So what you need to do is get a measuring jug and measure that out. And I'm using just a regular Pyrex kitchen measuring jug, and it goes up in sections of 100 there. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm going to need to do another 250 millilitres. It just so happens I've got a spare jug here. Okay, in this section we're going to be just double checking the weight of our plaster. If it's already bagged, all you need to do is get some kitchen scales, such as these. And these kitchen scales are already set to grams. So I can change it to millilitres, grams on my particular scales. So grams is fine, but the important thing to do is, if you're going to be using a bowl, is to zero your scales, pressing the 0 button, so it takes into account the container on top. Okay, great, mine's showing 0 grams, that's perfect. Now the second thing I'm going to do is take my plaster, and we know that 1,000 grams is a kilogram, so we're going to weigh out approximately 1 kilo of this plaster. That's about 1/5 of this bag. Okay, so this is the important part here. You'll notice I've got my flexible bowl, and what we're going to be doing is we're going to be pouring the water straight into the bowl, and we're going to be adding the plaster to the water. This is the correct way to mix plaster, and it stops the plaster getting too clumpy. Now, what I'm going to do is just pour this in. And then I'm going to take my bowl of dry plaster and add handfuls in, little by little, until it absorbs. And what you want to do is saturate the plaster so that it becomes completely sodden, and then we're going to start to mix the plaster once that's all absorbed the water. Don't pour it all in one go. Take your time with this step and you'll get a better plaster mix. So now we've got our plaster mix. I'm going to bring it across and I'm just going to show you here. I'm not going to put it on, but I'm just going to hold this above here. I'm going to put my hand in and start to slowly move this round. Okay, I'm being very careful to get the lumps from the side and mix those in. Now plaster will give off a chemical reaction as it's moving, as it start getting warmer and warmer as this goes on. But what you want is a nice smooth consistency with minimum air bubbles. You might notice I'm just moving my hand up and down on the top of the plaster surface there to get some of those air bubbles to the surface. So as I mix, it's going to agitate the plaster. I'm not bringing my hand up and putting air into the mix. I'm slowly moving it round. Now, this might take a few minutes, but you'll feel the plaster get stiffer and more difficult to mix as this goes on. So I'll come back once the plaster is ready to pour and I shall show you what to do. Okay, so my plaster's now starting to stiffen off and you can see it's starting to get a bit more of a thicker consistency and I can feel it's getting a bit more pull on my hand as I'm moving round. So I think this is a good position to start casting. So I'm going to agitate these bubbles out the top and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour into the centre and try and keep a consistent pour. I'm doing it at quite a liquid stage here because I want to pick up as much detail as I can. Now I'm going to leave a bit of this plaster in the bowl for in a minute to stiffen off. But one of the things we want to do is get into all that detail. And you might want to use the back of your hand to help push that out. Now some of this excess might chip off later. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep some of this in the bowl to mix here to thicken off. Now the casting process should take round about 20 to 40 minutes to fully set. About 15 to 20 minutes for the plaster to go off and 40 minutes for it to be fully cured. Now at this stage, if you want to be really decorative, you can also place some plaster objects in the back. One of the things that you can do with a plaster is you can also build a barrier on top to make it thicker using bits of wood and pour up to the edges there if you want to. But for ours, we're just going to do a really simple cast to show you guys how to do it. Now try and use all the plaster, because if you don't get it out of the bowl, you've just got to chip it out later. And just for good measure, I'm going to drop a few bits and pieces onto the back of my mould to give it a crazy sculptural finish. Now the trick to getting these bottle tops in is to get them setting just as the plaster's getting thick so that they set into the plaster. Now the important thing to do now is to be patient and leave this to set. So we're going to come back in about half an hour or 20 minutes when this is all set nicely. Don't be tempted to take it out too soon, or else your plaster mould will be breaking due to the plaster not being set properly. So our plaster's just setting quite nicely now. I just want to show you one technique at this stage, which we call like the cheesy stage, where it has a kind of cheese-like texture. It's easy enough to start to carve and draw into the plaster itself. So I'm just here doing some little designs. You might want to use a chopstick. You might want to use something with texture. Don't press in too hard, but you can actually use this at this stage just to agitate and to develop that surface. So I'm going to really quickly put in just a couple of little lines to give myself some abstract squiggles around the back. Okay, fantastic. And the casting process has finished. I've just put my hand to the plaster and it's gone cold again after being warm. I can feel that a little bit of warmth but it's certainly cooled off. So that means that the plaster's now quite solid and a lot safer to take out. If you take it out before the chemical process has happened, it will fall apart and crumble. It's very important to be patient. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start to demould. Oh, you can see there, these edges are very brittle because they are not the deep part of the mould. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to dig around under my mould, and I'm going to get an area where I can start to release it.
And you can see my dad's doing a really good job at the moment.
Okay, so I'm going to dig around this mould. Some of these fragile edges may chip off. Don't worry too much. That's quite normal because these aren't the main part of the cast. These are just the overspill from the actual cast itself. Okay. If you're on the beach, you'll have plenty of working room. If you're working in a mould like this, it might be a little bit more tricky. Okay, that's it. So that's now opened up. And now what we need to do is remove the excess sand from our cast. Okay, for those of you working at home, a hose pipe is a fantastic way of removing this excess sand. And you'll see here, as I give it a quick rinse, it's revealing all of that cool detail. And I think this is fantastic, like a crazy archaeological monster. Okay, so the final thing to do is if you want to remove some of the excess from your design, you can break off the fragile bits and start to shape your piece. You'll notice on the back we've got this crazy cool pattern with all these bits in it. This is the final segment of the tutorial where we're looking at the finished plaster cast. You'll see all the bits that are embedded here. I've also used a kind of polish to create this graphite style effect. You might notice that I've kept some of these bits clear from being too coated. So the mother of pearl stands out against this kind of graphite grey exterior. Now you can try a load of different materials. Acrylic will probably work better than poster paint, and you'll probably need to let your plaster dry out slightly before application, just so that it absorbs some of that paint. You might get a good finish with spray paint. It's all up to you. However, have a go, have an experiment, and I'm waiting to see what you guys produce.